Welcome to Talking Africa on Arise News, a special weekly edition of Africa Wrap, where we take time to reflect on the fortunes and affairs of the emerging continent within its own countries and across the world in an hour of conversation with African commentators, thought leaders and high achievers. Well, time now to welcome founder of fact-checking website Africa Check, the Deputy Director at AFP Foundation and author of My Nigeria. Peter Cunliffe-Jones is a journalist with more than 20 years' experience and has also written for The Economist, The Independent and The Guardian and worked with Al Jazeera, BBC and CNN. Peter, thank you very much indeed for coming in. You've been a journalist, as we mentioned there, for more than 20 years. You've been writing about Africa for a significant part of that time. Where did that passion for the continent come from?
Well, I think it started with at university. I started off doing international history and sort of steered very quickly into African history because it was something, I suppose, in a way that it wasn't and isn't still well taught in English schools, and so it seemed a very interesting field to learn about to me, and I suppose I've kept up that interest ever since.
And you've worked as a journalist on 3 continents. I mean, you worked here in London, you reported at the end of the Bosnian War, and in Hong Kong as chief editor for Asia. You also lived and worked in Lagos as bureau chief for the AFP, covering Nigeria as it ended about 3 decades of military rule. I want to talk a little bit about the highlight of your career, but first of all, tell us about that time in Lagos as military rule came to an end.
Well, I think it was a seminal time for Nigeria. I arrived there a month to the day after General Abacha, the sort of late dictator, died. There was a lot of uncertainty. You had visits from Kofi Annan as the UN Secretary General, from high-ups from the EU, from all sorts of people trying to see what was going to happen. Everybody was nervous. They didn't know what direction the then still military government was going to take. And over 4 years, you had the transition to elected rule, but not yet really still a full democratic rule in many ways, many people felt. And it was a tense time. You had a lot of, there's a lot of civil unrest, which I think is something that you see in many countries where you've had quite a sort of top-down government, either a dictatorship or a sort of very rigid regime. That regime goes, you very often, conflict often follows, and we saw that. So it was a difficult time, but a very fascinating time to report on.
But you've actually been quoted as saying that other places that are not Nigeria might be less challenging, but generally they're less joyful. What does that mean?
I think Nigerians have without overgeneralizing, Nigerians have a great sense of life, and it's something that I found. I've worked in Eastern Europe, I've worked in Eastern Asia, and they are parts of the world that have fascinating aspects to them, but there isn't the sense of joy, the sense of determination to get the most out of life that you find in Nigeria.
Somebody said it was like a childlike sort of enthusiasm for everything around them, a fascination with everything around. It's like, wow, look at that, I can do this, I can do that. Sort of
I mean, Nigeria to me is a place that can get you to experience a whole range of emotions in one day, and you can go from sort of tremendous frustration, things aren't working. People talk about the Nigeria problem or the Nigeria challenge, you'll see great cruelty, you'll see great humanity, you'll see great compassion being shown, and humour. It's always things being done with humour, and that's something that I haven't experienced elsewhere, having lived in a lot of different places.
So in a way, it's fair to say that it was a very puzzling, but also a very exciting place. But then you you know, you documented the changes in that country as it happened for the world. I mean, since that time, what are the biggest changes that you've seen in Nigeria since perhaps, you know, since about when you left?
Well, I mean, the most obvious one, but it's something of a cliche these days, but valid nevertheless, I think, is the change brought by the mobile phone and the internet and so on. I mean, when I arrived, it was said that there were 400,000 phone lines in the country, not very much, you know, and a tiny percentage of those were working all the time. To run our office, we had 10 phone lines into our office, and at any one time we had perhaps 2 or 3 might be working. These days, almost every Nigerian has a mobile phone. Not every, but almost every Nigerian.
So those are things that have come in. Those are gains. What about the things that are lacking?
I think that, I mean, so that has changed. I think what you see if you go, I arrived in '98. I'd first visited in the late '80s. The electricity generation is still within a few percentage points of where it was when I arrived in '98, and that's. I mean, I remember reporting on assiduously on all of the claims being made by President Obasanjo when he took power about what he was going to do to change that. That's the most obvious thing that holds the country back. Whether you're running a little hairdressing salon or running a newspaper, as some of my friends were doing, you trying to run a huge printing press every day, you need electricity.
Absolutely.
The world needs electricity to work, and that's the most obvious thing, I think, that hasn't changed at all.
Well, Peter, stay with us. We'll take a very short break here, but when we come back, we'll be talking to Peter Cunliffe-Jones about his book, My Nigeria, 5 Decades of Independence. Do stay with us.
The best way to predict the future is to create it. There's a special breed of achievers out there called tomorrow's people. They imagine what will be and strive to make it happen. They refuse to wait for the future. Tomorrow bends and conforms to their ideas. At Access Bank, we share the same sentiments. Our mantra for success is simple: speed, service, and security. Tomorrow's people own the future because they keep the world turning. That is the power of taking tomorrow.
Welcome back to Talking Africa here on Arise News. Let's continue the conversation with my guest, the journalist, author, and founder of fact-checking website Africa Check, Peter Cunliffe-Jones. Let's talk about your book, My Nigeria, 5 Decades of Independence. It's part family memoir, part history. It's a sort of piercing look at the colonial legacy of an emerging power in Africa. What prompted you to write the book?
Well, I think, in a way, I think every journalist who goes to a country wants to write a book about it. But for me, one of the reasons that I wanted to go to Nigeria in particular was that my family had a history there. My grandfather had lived in Nigeria from 1928 through to 1955. He ended up working in the colonial service.
That's very interesting.
Working as he was lieutenant governor for the Western region. He was involved in the negotiations for independence. And so I knew through him and through reading his diaries, personal diaries, the experience that he'd had. I then arrived just as military rule was ending, and wanted to understand why Nigeria was where it was at the time, and where in many ways it still is now, and to see to what extent the colonial history had played a part in that.
That must have given you a fascinating insight into Nigeria, given that you'd had a relative before you who'd been there at a critical stage in Nigeria's evolving history, and then you came in at also a very critical point in the country's evolution.
I mean, I think it does give you an insight. I mean, what I tried to do in the book is to the main people that I tried to talk to are Nigerians, because they are the people with the best voice on what goes on. But I used the knowledge that I had from his own records, his own diaries, which my grandmother had given me after he passed away. But also, I'd lived in after living in Nigeria, I lived in Asia, as you mentioned, and I saw what was to me a very striking comparison to be made between Nigeria and Indonesia. Both of them major countries, both of them with an oil industry, both of them with decades of military rule, with high degrees of corruption. But Nigeria had not, when I looked at it, had not progressed in the same way that Indonesia did over the same period of time, from the mid-60s through to the late 90s. And I wanted to know, and I think there are some answers to be told, about why that was, and what in many ways, the colonial history had to play a part in that.
Well, one critic who looked at Indonesia and Nigeria said the difference was that Indonesia was corrupt and Nigeria was corrupt, but the Indonesians didn't take it all, and the Nigerians did. I don't know whether that's true or not, but this book also reveals quite extraordinary truths, if you like, about governance in Nigeria. I'm curious to know how people in Nigeria have received it.
Well, pleasingly well, I'd have to say. The proudest moment of my career was I had a commendation from Chinua Achebe, who I'd interviewed when I was there as a reporter for AFP, and I sent it off very nervously to one of his sons, who passed it to him, and he was very polite about it. So, which I don't think. To me, if it sells many copies, that's great. What really pleased me was that sort of welcome.
Well, the book also highlights, one of the things you point out is the enormous waste of resources that has happened in Nigeria. Were you shocked when you saw how much had gone to waste?
I think yes. In summary, yes. There's one of the things that I talk about is the fact that I went in 2002. I went in 2002 up to Maiduguri to the palatial home of a late trading magnate called Maidaribe. He died recently, and I was taken round his home by one of his sons. And it was a home that, according to media reports in the Nigerian media, they called it the $100 million home. This is what he was said to have spent on the home. It's filled with gold, with marble, with beautiful fabrics and diamond-tipped chandeliers. It's an extraordinary building. And I went outside with his son, who very kindly showed me around, and I couldn't hear a sound other than the sound of the crickets. What I couldn't hear was the sound of industry, of people doing a regular job in a regular way. And that's the thing that struck me, was the extreme poverty in Borno State, as one of the poorest, if not the poorest states in the region, and this tremendous wealth. And I don't think it's a coincidence that if we look at what's happening in Nigeria in the northeast today, that difference I don't think is coincidental at all.
And you captured some of this in the book.
Yes, indeed.
The book, you were talking about Chinua Achebe there earlier. He called it a triumph. You were being modest, but he actually called it a triumph. How did that make you feel when he said that?
Well, it was it's tremendous. I mean, he's my favourite author bar none, and because I think he writes about Nigeria in a way it's not about Nigeria. It's a humanity. He writes about humanity in a way that is so touching. So for somebody of his stature to praise what you've done is obviously incredibly pleasing.
Well, stay with us. Peter has said that in some ways writing the book led him to set up Africa Check, Africa's first fact-checking organisation. We'll be talking about that right after this short break.
Wherever and whatever your banking needs, Guarantee Trust Bank will be there, now and into the future. Because you're at the heart of everything we do. Guarantee Trust Bank, proudly African, truly international.
Welcome back to Talking Africa here on Arise News. We're joined by the journalist, author and founder of fact-checking website Africa Check, Peter Cunliffe-Jones. Now, you set up the Africa Check website in 2012. Why did you set it up? Why did you see the need for it?
I mean, there are fact-checking websites in other parts of the world, so it's not something unique that we've done, but it's the first fact-checking website, independent fact-checking website based in Africa. I think when we set it up, it's set up by the AFP Foundation in a partnership with the journalism department at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, because people need information. One of the people who backs the project is the former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, and he said that when we were talking about it with him, that if people, that democracy, in order to work, requires people to be able to debate known facts. If you don't have a good basis of facts that you can agree on, you're not having a debate, you're having an argument. In all different sorts of ways, that sort of common basis of well understood, commonly agreed facts doesn't exist for all sorts of reasons, and what we're trying to do is to help that help the process of producing that sort of fact-based scrutiny that we think there should be.
So who uses it, and what are they using it for?
Well, all sorts of people. We have about 100,000 visitors to the website a month. We produce reports. So far, we've produced 200 reports in the last 3 years. They are given out to media houses. They've been published in media in South Africa and Nigeria, where we're now operating as well. The researchers go on, will go on the media. They'll talk to shows such as your own or others on the radio. The aim is always to try to look at claims that are being made, whether that's by politicians, by public figures, by institutions, or by the media houses themselves, and look at the evidence for that, the evidence against it, and come to a conclusion that will help the reader to say, well, actually, I think this is nonsense. Or, in fact, there's some truth in what they're saying, but it's being presented in a skewed way. Or, look, this is an entirely legitimate thing that they're claiming.
So somebody, asks a question and you essentially check it and answer it?
Yes. Yes.
Now, you set up Africa Check, as you said, in partnership with the Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg.
That's right.
Who came up with the idea to collaborate with each other, sort of the university and yourself?
Well, we approached the university, but I mean they have the journalism department there is run by a great former journalist, in fact still working journalist, Professor Anton Harbour, who had been at what's now the Mail and Guardian. He'd been instrumental in the setting up of the Mail and Guardian back in the 1980s in South Africa. And he very quickly understood what we were trying to do and the sort of journalistic value and then the broader societal value that we see in what we're trying to do.
Tell us some of the big stories that have come out of Africa Check and have become gained a lot of sort of international press. Because I think, for example, there was an investigation into whether South Africa's whites were really being killed like flies or something like that. Was that one of the reports you worked on?
There was there was a claim being made by a prominent South African singer, and it's made more broadly by different elements of the Afrikaner community in South Africa, that whites are being particularly targeted for killing in crime in general in South Africa. There were a whole series of claims that were made. We looked at them. We found our researcher found the claims to be baseless, and we published the report. And it did get a lot of attention, and we hope. I mean, our intent is never to prove one side right, to prove one side wrong. It's to look at the evidence and show people the evidence, and let them come to the conclusion about what it shows.
So, how important a tool has Africa Check become for people like journalists? Because I mean, it provides tips, it provides advice, and also online resources to the people in the media.
Well, I mean, we work a lot with the media. I mean, that's a primary way that we work. The Mail and Guardian, which I mentioned, the Daily Maverick, dozens of South African newspapers use our reports. The same now in Nigeria with Daily Trust, with This Day, with Vanguard, and others taking the reports that we produce. I
imagine it would be very important for journalists in Africa to improve their sort of fact-checking.
It's one of the things. I mean, it's something. It's important for journalists everywhere to improve it. I mean, and one of the keys to this is that all the researchers who work on this are African. I mean, I don't work on the editorial side of the site, but so it's important for people everywhere. Yes, what we're aiming to do is not simply to produce our own reports ourselves, but to enable others. I mean, as part of that, for example, we have just launched again this year the second round of an awards program. We ran it for the first time last year. It was won by a great team from Ghana. There was a runner-up from Zambia and one from Kenya, because we're seeking to foster a culture of fact-checking and reward the good work that is being done too.
Do you think there's a big need for that sort of website across Africa?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Later this year in London, there's a gathering of fact-checking sites from all over the world. So I don't want to suggest that there's a greater need in Africa than there is in elsewhere.
Well, the reason that would make sense is the fact that, I mean, there are not that many fact-checking sort of organizations in Africa, are there?
No. And so, I mean, but that's it. I do think it is very desperately needed, because there are enormous numbers of claims that are made that are simply dangerous for society to go unchecked. If I give the examples of around Ebola, all of the fake claims for false cures or false means of treatment. The claims that you saw recently in the run-up to the wave of xenophobic violence in South Africa, there were a lot of claims being made about the position that migrants take in South African society, exaggerating the numbers, exaggerating the impact that they have on the economy. So we looked at those issues, and we produced reports that are then very widely picked up, trying to say we don't take a view on what people should do with the information, but trying to say that you need to have, in order to take a rational decision about what's the best thing to do about Ebola, about the way society functions, you need the facts.
Have you been sort of surprised by the sort of enormous response you've received? Because, I mean, I understand that in 2013 it won the runner-up. It was the runner-up in the digital media section of the One World Media Awards in London. It was the runner-up in the Highway Africa Awards in South Africa, and it's been profiled in the New York Times and The Economist.
Well, it's great. I mean, no, we've been, I mean, surprised, yes, delighted. We have a really good team of journalists that we're working with. We hope soon to be launching a version of the site in French in Senegal. So we work with some great people, and because I think the strength of the reaction it goes back to what you were saying. This hasn't been done before, and there's been a need for it. It answers what I think is a universal human need for people to feel they're being told the truth.
Well, it's certainly making an impact, because it was also named this week as having one of the 100 most influential Twitter accounts in Africa. So it's clearly having a big impact, and you've got plans to expand.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we're on Twitter at Africa Check. We're on the website africacheck.org. We're looking to expand in the operations that we carry out in Nigeria. We'll make some developments on the site that will do more to enable people to more easily find reliable sources of information on topics that interest them, so that whether they're journalists or whether they're members of civil society or whether they're just ordinary citizens, they can fact-check claims for themselves.
Have you had any angry responses from anybody, governments perhaps?
Not really from governments so far. I mean, the people don't tend to like to be told that they're wrong. But in fact, I mean, what surprised us really has been the positive response. We've had a lot of people agree to make corrections to what they were saying. We had the main opposition party in South Africa, the DA, issued a statement after we fact-checked their claims in the run-up to the elections last year, saying that they accepted that some of the things that they said were wrong and they were going to correct those. And
briefly, any bizarre requests?
Well, quite a lot of bizarre requests that I probably couldn't say on air. I mean, one of the strangest ones was somebody asking us to check into the history of his brother-in-law, because he thought that he was a dishonest husband. So we said that wasn't really our remit, but no, we get a lot of strange requests, it's true.
Peter, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
My thanks to Peter Cunliffe-Jones. Stay with us to meet this week's Talking Africa panel as we look back at the week that's been. The big stories, the big issues. We continue the conversation in London with our next guests right here after this short break.
There is a reason Africa is called the new frontier. What was once potential is now an opportunity ready to be seized. Once revered for our resources, today's wealth lies in our people. People who build the cities that shape the future. People who know an idea in one place means business in another. A generation for whom technology means there are no borders, no boundaries. We are the new lions in a brave new world, kings of the urban jungle. And there's a bank that puts the world in our pocket.